Well, my name is Wendy Osborne, and on behalf of IAVE, I am delighted to welcome you to this third webinar in our series for this autumn, where we are looking at the common good, creating a sustainable future through volunteering. And we asked our presenters and moderators to do something a little bit different during this series, because we wanted these to be like opinion pieces, asking guest presenters to talk about issues that were important to them, either through their operational work or through their academic research. And then we asked guest moderators who come from a variety of backgrounds to join in that conversation, so that it's the conversation that actually enables people to learn and gain insights. And I think that's really important. And we're delighted that this particular series looks a little bit reflective of our World Volunteer Conference in 2022, but looks forward to our 2024 27th IAVE World Volunteer Conference to be held in Busan, almost a year from now in October 2024. The first paper that we had for this series was looking at employer-supported volunteering in Africa. And the second piece was looking at the leadership for volunteering, not just in a particular country, but in a region, where we looked at Trinidad and Tobago and then looked at the whole of the Caribbean region. And this third one will involve Dr. Bianca Fadel talking to us about volunteering in everyday life and crises and emergencies. So we are picking up on really interesting topics, and we are having great presenters and moderators to join us. And today our guest moderator is no stranger to IAVE. In fact, none of the presenters are strangers to IAVE, which is always great, because we really love to welcome colleagues and friends back with us again. So Dr. Amjad Saleem is the Manager for Volunteering Youth and Education Development Unit at the IFRC. He's the orchestrator of the Volunteer Youth and Education Development Unit and is based in Geneva. A global team focused on volunteering management, youth innovation and engagement, and education programming. And he comes with a wide range of experience, having worked in different perspectives of humanitarian work, interfaith engagement, and peace building. So him and both Dr. Fadel really align together in terms of their experience and their knowledge, and we were delighted to have both of them with us. I would also encourage people as participants on this webinar to give us your thoughts, to give us your questions, to join in the conversation. So please use the question and answer to do that. And Amjad will pick that up as the conversation progresses. So thank you very much. And it's over to you, Amjad. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wendy. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone from Geneva. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I want to thank Wendy for inviting me to come and be the guest moderator for this really exciting session with Bianca. And it's good to see a couple of familiar names as well in the participants list. So I feel like we're all a community that really is speaking about this issue. And it's a very important topic because, over the last few years, months, and even days, we've been reminded of the globalization of fragility, as the amount of crisis that is affecting our community intensifies. And we're always reminded of the art and the act of volunteering, which, at the essence is really about service, lending a helping hand to neighbors, friends, strangers, reflecting on our shared responsibility towards the other. Part to build the cohesive societies. This becomes more pronounced during times of emergencies. And we see people just stepping in when that call comes. Within the International Federation for Red Cross Red Crescent Societies, we talk about volunteers themselves coming from affected communities because they are there, they're local, they are the ones affected. But yet we see something that enables them, that despite everything, to step up and to provide support and comfort, even though they have been affected by themselves. There are narratives that talk about this, but as Bianca will sort of allude to, some of those narratives can be challenged. There are some that call them unsung heroes. Again, some of those narratives can be challenged. But we want to go deep into this today to really understand that, and we will go through case studies that will explore some of these challenges, some of these narratives. And I'm really pleased to welcome Dr. Bianca Fadel for this talk. It's we've been working together for quite a while between the University of Northumbria and IFRC, and I know Bianca's not a stranger to IAVE as well. But it's a real pleasure to have you here, Bianca. So thank you for coming. And just to reiterate some of the housekeeping rules, if you have any questions and questions, please put them into the question tab. It makes it easier for us to have a look at it. And of course, you have the chat there to kind of share where you're coming from and everything else. Beyond that, Bianca, I'm going to hand over to you. We'll go through your presentation and we'll have a little bit of a chat afterwards. I will probably switch my video off and then I'll switch it back on as you're coming close to it so that it allows you some bandwidth as well. So thank you very much, Bianca, over to you.
Thank you very much, Amjad, for the nice introduction, and thanks Wendy and Gal and all of the IAVE team for organizing this series, and also for inviting me to join you for today's webinar. So I do hope we can make it a conversation. Feel free to pop any comments or any reflections as well during my own presentation here, which will hopefully last not too long, giving us enough time for a nice discussion to explore these topics. So I have been asked by IAVE to speak about my views on what volunteering for the common good means and how this relates to creating a sustainable future through volunteering. So this is a big ask, and I'm not certainly the one with all the answers, but my take on it for this conversation here today will be to focus on volunteering and everyday life in crises and emergencies. So for the next 20 minutes or so, you will expect to just listen a little bit about the types of activities and research that we conduct here at the Center for Global Development at Northumbria University in the north of England, in Newcastle. And part of the work I have conducted myself, part of it has been in collaboration with colleagues and partners in different contexts as well. So I'll talk you through this a little bit and then bring you some highlights on 3 kind of examples that I think will help in our conversation with the types of work that volunteers have been doing in Burundi, Uganda, and India in relation to different types of crisis and emergency situations, and then conclude with some final reflections and basically getting some more questions out for us to share as a group in this conversation. And before we start really this debate, I just wanted to call you to this cartoon here on the slide, in which we do have the actual judges of any debates or any conversations that we're having when we're talking about the Sustainable Development Agenda, right? We can see here the effects of the climate emergency that is affecting all of us in different scales, and how much the communities affected need to be the actual participants in these conversations. And as Amjad has already mentioned, how much the volunteers that we're talking about here are also members of these affected communities themselves. So how can we take this into consideration a little bit as a nudge as we start this conversation here today? So if we move on to the next slide, please. Here you will see not only myself, but some of my colleagues who also work here at the Center for Global Development at Northumbria University. And we have been focusing on research that is related to topics on volunteering, humanitarian crisis, and development. And this has been done to the extent of our capacities in collaboration with partners, including the IFRC, as Amjad has mentioned, and other universities and institutes around the globe, trying to actually work in ways that are creative, that are collaborative, and that can allow an interdisciplinary approach to research. And this means trying to understand the types of work that communities do in relation to community action and innovation, tackling mobilities and displacement challenges, but also the overall types of responses to crises and disasters, and the ways of also trying to bridge these kind of silos that exist between academia and practitioners, right? So that we're all actually starting to talk around the same languages and providing the evidence that can be useful to be able to support processes of change that I know that all of us here in this discussion, all the participants here in the room, will be leading in different ways. So our work at the center in terms of research has been moving in this direction to be able to collaborate not only amongst staff and PhD researchers, but also practitioners and policymakers to try and provide these type of evidence that can be then used in different contexts. So before I get into the examples that I mentioned just now, if we move on to the next slide, I just wanted to get us all on the same page in relation to this broader topic that Wendy mentioned in the introduction as well, that the IAVE conference next year will be focusing on, which is related to the Sustainable Development Agenda, and how much the types of voluntary labor that we all know that happen across the globe are central to meet the different challenges and development issues that we know communities will be facing across the globe. So we know that these types of crises and emergencies are multiple, interconnected, sometimes overlapping, in the sense that we are not only talking about one-off conflicts or disaster situations, but also the types of protracted crises in which the vulnerabilities are happening at different levels. People are facing issues related to poverty and struggling for livelihood strategies on top of any other kind of conflict and emergency situations. And then we do have the climate emergency, as mentioned before as well, as a cross-cutting topic. So we know that volunteers are present and are doing work in different formats, in different ways, at the same time that they are living through these challenges. So I think the key here is to try and understand how can we then work in terms of pushing this agenda forward to not only acknowledge volunteers as volunteers themselves, but also the types of vulnerabilities that they might also be facing in the process of conducting activities and work. So we know that the Sustainable Development Agenda is a wide and quite broad kind of scope of work, and that the member states of the United Nations have been providing updates regularly on the progress of these. We're more than halfway through now, 2030, which feels a bit insane if we really think about it, how much the time is passing, and we're working towards an agenda that is actually less than halfway from us in terms of the time since this was committed in 2015. So to monitor the progress of this agenda, we have the voluntary national reviews, the VNRs, that member states produce and then share with the high-level political forum of the UN. And volunteering has been part of half of these national reviews that were submitted. And the types of ways that volunteers are engaged are mentioned in terms of the experiences, the successes, the challenges, so that the member states can share their knowledge with the other states as well as stakeholders. So in this graph that you can see here on the screen, what we can learn is that the Sustainable Development Goal 17, which is the partnership for the goals, is the one that is often largely associated with volunteering from the analysis of the voluntary national reviews, which means that, again, we're getting back to the cross-cutting roles of volunteers in this context of the SDGs agenda. But there are also very strong connections that were perceived in relation to SDG 11 on the reduced inequalities focus, as well as 12 on the focus of consumption and production in responsible ways, and 16 on peace, justice, and strong institutions. So this is just to give us a little bit of a background in relation to the SDGs agenda. And we do talk a lot about volunteering as part of the implementation of this agenda, but actually there is still a need of further evidence on how volunteering is perceived and what the impacts are of the types of work that volunteers will conduct across settings, and particularly in the Global South, because we know about the challenges of gathering information and learning from across settings, and in particular in the volunteer and development sector, how much this is also related to the types of resources and efforts that are involved. So how can we then learn from different contexts and apply this information as part of our learning process as well? So in the next slide, I will start by just sharing some of my own experience conducting research for my PhD work in Burundi, in East Africa. This was also a collaboration with local partners, including the Red Cross and the Red Crescent movement. And part of the learning from this PhD research is related to volunteering and the rhythms of everyday life. So basically, understanding volunteering not only as a one-way system of helping others, but actually how much of the volunteering experience becomes a space of learning, sharing, coping, co-creating experiences that will support the livelihood strategies and the types of needs that volunteers themselves will identify and have in their own everyday life. So here in the chart, you can see the aspects of belonging connected to the sustainable development efforts, in the sense that people being together not only means the aspect of sharing the same physical spaces, but also sharing their own lifestyles, their own expectations, and how much that affects these processes of bottom-up agency that will emerge from their own experiences, and that will then also affect the type of activities that they conduct as volunteers themselves. So we're talking about the specific contexts and routines from rural and urban settings, for example, to be attentive to this micro level of the volunteering experience, and how much the cultural identity and the traditions of a specific context will affect as well the types of volunteering that people will conduct. And at the end of the day, we are not only talking about volunteers supporting others, but we're talking about volunteers supporting each other as well. So reinforcing their local capacities and allowing themselves to be able to respond to crises and emergencies, but also to the protected types of challenges that they face in ways that strengthen their own livelihoods. And this relates not only to the sense of belonging to the wider community in the context where they live, but specifically in this context of Burundi, I found the sense of belonging to volunteer groups that might not necessarily be involving an organization, but it could be groups of friends, neighbors, people coming together and then sharing and being able to learn from each other and to cope. So this is also what is highlighted here in the quote that you can see in the screen, in the sense that this local volunteer spoke to me about how much she felt that the spirit of volunteers was open, that they knew each other, and that when they were vulnerable amongst the volunteers themselves, they were the first to be surrounded and to be visited by other volunteers. So this is just to give a bit of a sense of this two-way process of understanding volunteering in relation to the everyday living experiences at the community level. So our second example here in this presentation, to be able to share from different contexts with you in the next slide, will be about a different research project that was a wider collaborative project involving partners and universities in Uganda. And we have then used the work, the case study of young refugees working as volunteers in the context of Uganda to understand the types of experiences that they have and how much it is connected to livelihood strategies amongst the refugee communities. And this project has been longer, has been using different methods. And I must say that at the start of the project, we had several interviews and workshops with different stakeholders, including government officials, organizations, volunteers themselves. And one of them, quoted here in the slide, told us that he didn't believe that a poor man can volunteer, that a poor man is actually looking for a way of survival. So that was pretty much the narrative that we could hear at the start of this project. And then as we evolved and tried to collect data from young refugees, volunteers themselves, we have actually noted that there was a very high rate of volunteering participation amongst young refugees in Uganda. So the numbers that you can see here in the slide, so over 60% of the over 3,000 respondents that we had in a large-scale survey that was conducted as part of this project told us that they were currently volunteering at the time that this survey was conducted. And half of those current volunteers were coming from households earning less than $28 a month, which falls below the global threshold of the poverty line. And on top of this 60% here that we see in the slide, another 10% had told us at the time that they had conducted some form of volunteering since becoming refugees, even if they were not volunteering at that specific point in time. So it does show that these high rates of volunteering participation are contrasting with the narratives claiming that the so-called poor cannot volunteer. And it's probably again related to the ways of understanding volunteering and questioning a little bit the Western-centric concepts and ideas that might not associate volunteering with an act that can happen amongst people that would be considered marginalized in our communities. So it does paint a more complex picture of volunteering in relation to livelihood strategies and in relation to the coping mechanisms that people will have in different contexts. And part of this complex picture is also related to the issue of income generation in volunteering, through volunteering and involuntary spaces. So the second number that you can see highlighted here in the slide is showing that half of the respondents who told us they were currently volunteering at the time of the survey actually also told us that they were earning some or all of their income through volunteering. And this has to do with different types of financial rewards that are associated with volunteer work, often through organizations, but also in different ways. So it does blur a little bit the line about how we understand volunteering in this particular context of refugee communities, for example, and that not all types of practices and ideas of volunteering will be the same, will be equal, and also pushing us to question a little bit this emphasis on volunteering activities that are programmed, that are auditable, and that will often be seen as skill acquisition kind of processes to be able to acquire the proper job, when a lot of the examples we have seen in this case will show that volunteering is considered as work by many people. So there's a lot of complexity in this understanding, and that's part of what I wanted to bring to us here for our discussion, so that unless we start understanding that and taking a step back from some of the assumptions that we might have, the implications of that would be to exclude local histories and types of practice of everyday volunteering in contexts of crises, emergencies, and vulnerabilities that can then risk reproducing different layers, including of inequalities, including labor market inequalities in relation to the types of opportunities that are available to people and the types of work that are considered valuable and valid in this context. So I will just pop in the project website here on the chat in case you'd like to check any further information about this particular research, and then move on to our third example here in this webinar that will be in the next slide, trying to bring a little bit of a different context for our conversation. So talking about the types of volunteering in response to climate adaptation and disasters in the Indian Sundarbans. And I think this moves us a bit to a different geographical location, but also allows us to question a little bit also of what the everyday means in this context and how much we need to understand the types of voluntary labor that are happening within or without kind of an involvement of organizations and different contexts. So if I can just ask Gal to please play the video. This is a very short animation of just 3 minutes, and I will stop speaking now so you can see it. Thank you very much for watching this with us. And I think just a few comments about this ongoing project, which is, as you could see in the animation, trying to generate new information, new data on the types of voluntary labor that is mobilized in this particular context of the deltas in West Bengal, and how much of that labor is happening but is still very invisible to most of us, and sometimes it's not even considered or spoken about as volunteering itself. So the whole point of this project, for which the data collection is still ongoing, is about prompting these conversations and hearing from volunteers themselves on the types of activities and work that they do, and how much that is happening in response to the crises and emergencies that they face. And I did notice a question here that was popped into the questions and answers about the methodology of the previous projects. So most of these projects have adopted qualitative work, meaning that we have been engaging with volunteers through different participatory methodologies, and also the interviews and the group discussions. And that was certainly the case for the first example of the Burundi work with volunteers, and then also on the second example of the work in Uganda, which has then been complemented through a mixed methods approach, working with them through the survey data collection that was related to the numbers that I mentioned, and how much we have tried to use the scale of the learning through the survey to understand the experiences of volunteers in further depth through photo, voice, and visual methodologies itself. So just to say that there is a range of techniques and strategies that we have tried to use in these examples that I have shared, to be able to allow us to get these highlights and get this learning, and to discuss and to see the ways forward in terms of understanding the work that volunteers conduct, and the types of activities that they do in different contexts. So this brings me to these final reflections before we open up to the discussion, which are connecting it back to the overall topic of IAVE's conference next year. So we're talking about people power, creating a sustainable future through through volunteering. And I think understanding volunteers as the champions of development agendas and efforts is almost something that is taken as a given in this context, as we are always discussing and talking about the types of work that volunteers do. But if the question is about what volunteering means for the common good, then I think my challenge question to it is related to how can we understand what the common good means for volunteers themselves, and for the types of voluntary labor that they are conducting in response to crises and emergencies, in particular for our discussion today, but even more widely, and how much of that will be entangled with issues that are related to poverty, livelihoods, inequalities, and the climate emergency that is affecting all of us to different extents. And we know that a lot of what happens in these spaces is still pretty much invisible, and volunteer voices can be missing from the conversations. And I think the provocation that we can see here in this final cartoon in the slide is exactly about that. So we have two women talking about how much this person that doesn't look like he belongs to the same community wouldn't listen to them, that he keeps wanting to build something that clearly is being seen by community members as ineffective, and that he has already been told that his theory of change is flawed. So I think it's about us all challenging a little bit how are we using the frameworks and the spaces that we have to be able to generate spaces for listening, spaces for learning, and including volunteers and community members, and acknowledging the overlaps between these two personas, right? And pushing the agenda further in terms of creating effectively spaces where we can all contribute as academics, as practitioners, to creating the sustainable future through volunteering. So I'll finish off with this open question really for discussion, and hand it over back to Amjad so we can have a conversation about this. Thanks very much.
Great. No, thank you so much, Bianca, for that really, really excellent sort of presentation, and lots of things coming up in my mind, and I'm sure with our colleagues as well online, in terms of what are some of the things that are there. But I mean, one thing that really speaks out of what you're saying is this idea of how do we understand volunteering, right? And sort of what is the notion of what we look at in terms of volunteering, and how do we bring that to communities? Because there is, as you've said, there is a lived experience of people volunteering. There is that local aspect that is there. And so, what do we mean by volunteering? And I think there's a question already there around, I think to unpack particularly the Uganda case around, when you started talking about income generation and volunteering, it doesn't go in the same, at least our understanding from the global north, or from Europe and North America, is that doesn't really equate, right? So I think, but it really speaks to that aspect of understanding that local knowledge of volunteering. I liked what you also talked about volunteering as this learning process, and I think this is something that we constantly sort of say within the Red Cross, is that it is an informal education, and in fact a lot of the skills that one gets as volunteering actually takes you much further in life than you would get there. And so that's why all of the organizations that do sort of promote volunteering, which is the Red Cross or the Scouts or everyone, that is part of what we're looking at. But one thing that also I think, and again, this is work that we are looking at within the Federation when it comes to particularly emergencies and crisis, is that you also have to kind of look at the volunteer management, the volunteer development as part of that process. So it's not just enough to have volunteers show up and respond to the disaster. How do you manage them? How do you motivate them? How do their sense of well-being, their training, all of that is important, even at the local level, to ensure that you're getting the best out of them, but also that you're meeting those needs. So I think that there's a lot to unpack there, and I'd welcome people to share questions that they might have regarding that, maybe. But Bianca, just taking my moderator's prerogative a little bit, I wanted to unpack that final question that you had, right, or the final aspect around the invisibility of those volunteer voices. And I know part of it, I think you alluded to, saying that we're not necessarily listening to that, so that there's a power play that is there. But I wanted to unpack that a little bit to kind of figure out what could we, as academics and practitioners, what is it that we need to be doing differently to represent that? Because a number of us come from those or represent those communities, right? So it's not that they're not invisible, but is there something that we're missing that we need to be able to look at?
Thanks very much, Amjad. And I think these are indeed important questions for us all to consider in terms of the type of research work that we do, but also the work as practitioners as well in this space. And I think it also connects to the question that Helene posted here in the chat that you have already nudged to. And the only kind of like my starting point to this is the importance of who is in the room at the point of like how can we define, how can we understand the types of volunteering and what volunteering means in very context specific ways. And I think this is definitely a starting point to be able to move this agenda forward. And my example from the work that we have done collaboratively in Uganda, and I'll just try and pop it into the chat here so that you can see as like an example, is that at the start of this project focused on young refugees experiences in Uganda, the first activity was actually to be able to engage with young refugees themselves, to be able to make sure this research was embedded in the context in which they work and live. And we have then engaged with a group of young refugees who were then part of a youth advisory board membership within the scope of the project. So, for example, the definition that I've just popped here into the questions and answers to be able to expand on the question posed, and thanks to Helene for posing this important question, is related to a definition that was adopted in collaboration with this particular group and allowing them as well to highlight things that are important for them. And you can see here that in this definition used in the project, we are talking about volunteering that can be unpaid or for a form of per diem or incentive. And I think this is obviously an issue that has been discussed in different contexts and will not necessarily apply to all the contexts. But I think the key of understanding income generation in this particular case, and as we know from other research in East Africa in particular as well, that this is something that we need to talk about instead of pretending that it doesn't connect necessarily to volunteering, but actually how much the language of volunteering has been also used by organizations, by government officials, and by different kind of stakeholders, also related to the types of inequalities and livelihood strategies that people are facing. So unpacking a little bit this complexity, but also again taking a step back to understand that there will be very different kind of experiences in each of the contexts that we live and work in, I think would be my starting point in this discussion, so that we're not assuming specific definitions or assuming specific types of experiences, but we're actually engaging with volunteers themselves and people that are affected by these types of crises and community and emergencies at the community level that we're talking about, and then having these open conversations that can move the agenda forward. Yeah.
No, thank you, Bianca. I think that's really helpful to kind of have that perspective of listening. In that sense, do you get a sense in terms of the difference of volunteers? So, for example, in Uganda, you've talked about youth volunteers, and I think in the video in India, it was sort of different communities, and then you had women volunteers in Burundi. Are there differences when you kind of disaggregate it into sort of different age, gender roles? I mean, does that have an effect on how we're looking at volunteering and the approach to volunteering?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what we have been finding across projects is that there are many variables that are affecting the types of experiences that people will have. And I think gender and age and also location, so place where people are definitely three of the aspects that I would highlight in this conversation. And I'm sure colleagues here in the room and the participants in this webinar will have different points of view and experience as well. So do feel free to pop any other reflections in the chat related to that. But I think specifically in relation to gender, for example, in the project in Uganda, we have found that there are inequalities in terms of the types of opportunities that people might be able to access in relation to income generation that we were just talking about, based on the issues of gender and place, and how much that is then leading to a certain context in which people will be working in different spaces and conducting different activities, but also limited by the types of opportunities that are available to them. So if we're talking about a change making and sustainable development agenda and trying to promote equity and promote transparency in all the work that we do, I think part of our learning and recommendations to organizations and to stakeholders engaging volunteers, for example, in refugee settings, has been to promote fairer practices and more transparent kind of guidelines in relation to what's expected and who is able to engage and the types of requirements that people might need to have to be able to volunteer in the first place. So I think we're talking about how much these variables might affect the access to opportunities in the first place, but also during any volunteering activity and any type of response to crisis, emergencies, or any community needs, how much that also influences their own experience in this ongoing process, I would say.
Great, well, thank you. I mean, there's a couple of questions that are coming up. I think one is less of a question, more of a comment, but I think it really much feeds to that aspect you were talking about the criteria or being very clear on what you're expecting in terms of volunteering. And I think Sylvia has sort of shared her experience from Brazil in terms of having a specific understanding about volunteering that is there, and that helps them to kind of develop that. Willem has a question around any research or data on how refugees in Europe perceive volunteering in relation to income generation, and what does this mean for influencing policymakers to allow refugees to volunteer or not?
Thanks very much, both Sylvia and Willem, for the comments here and the questions in the chat. I think these are all adding to this point that we discussed about the need for context-specific learning and knowledge gathering and knowledge sharing in each of the contexts that we live and work in. So it's really interesting to hear about the focus of the surveys in Brazil, Sylvia, and thanks for sharing the links with everyone here, and the fact that the different ways of seeing volunteering as spontaneous, unpaid, and different forms of giving out time or resources is certainly part of an ongoing learning for all of us in each of the regions and countries we are working. And specifically to the question that Willem has asked on the perception of income generation in relation to refugees in Europe, I must say that I don't have that information, and I think that's definitely an area of further exploration to see like the different contexts and how much it affects the types of volunteering activity that refugees are allowed to undertake. I must say that also it changes in relation to each country depending on the right to work that refugees might have. So for example, in Uganda, they do have the right to work in the country, and that's not the case during processing times for many countries in different regions, and that's something to consider, how much work and volunteering in the context of refugee response will be also affected by the limitations that refugees themselves will be facing. So I think your question on what it means to influencing policy makers in that space will also be context specific. So then it will allow definitely more scope for discussion on how volunteering might also be used as a smokescreen sometimes for the types of inequalities and limitations to access to the job market and the labor market, as we know in different contexts. So I would definitely invite you, if you are interested, to check the types of policy briefings and recommendations that have emerged from our project in Uganda, and we'll be happy to continue this conversation as well. And yeah, just making it very much about like the types of context and areas in which we work. Yeah.
Thanks. Bianca. And maybe just, Helen has sort of put in a perspective about level of individual community agency that is often missing. And I think maybe that's also slightly linked to the question that Jan had sort of asked, right, around refugees in Europe in terms of volunteering and those opportunities for that. And often I think what we often don't have, and I don't think we have much sight on that. And I think it's even something within the Red Cross. I think we need to. I'll be love to go back and find out a little bit more in terms of from our migration teams, is that we know that there are opportunities that are there, and depending on the context, refugees are providing volunteers, but often that gives them that sense of agency, that gives them that sense of contributing and developing that sense of belonging with the communities. It also means that there's also a sense of connection with communities, which then breaks that negative perception of who the refugee is. And many of the refugees who come to Europe are skilled in their own right. So I think that it provides that opportunity, but I don't think we've really unpacked that in a way that makes sense. And I think this is where perhaps that there needs to be a lot more learnings that are being shared. I think that we often kind of have learnings coming from Europe to other parts of the world, but actually maybe this time around some of the learnings from Uganda or places like that would be useful for how we engage with volunteers, refugees in that perspective. So I think that is something to look at. I wanted to sort of, as we have a few more minutes, and I'm inviting people, if you'd like to kind of share some more questions, please do. You and I have talked before on this about the romanticization of volunteering, right? Or particularly those volunteers in emergencies, the frontline responders, the heroes, all of that thing. And I wanted to kind of look at that because I think that there's definitely some pushback, even from volunteers themselves, who sort of say, don't call us heroes, right? We're just doing a job. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that, right? How do we look at that? And because again, you alluded to that narrative that we're looking at, and that we should be aware of when we talk about volunteers in local communities, and when we talk about our own understanding of volunteers. How do we place this perspective of that?
Yeah, thank you so much, Amjad. I think this is a very important question as we all move forward to understand the needs and the experiences of volunteers themselves, who will not necessarily be shielded or be protected by the role of volunteer, right? So that's the whole idea of like not romanticizing the idea of volunteers as heroes, in the sense that volunteers themselves will also be facing challenges and vulnerabilities, and this needs to be acknowledged, understood, but also acted upon to provide volunteers with the safety nets and the opportunities to be safe, secure, and to keep their well-being whilst they are conducting any type of work. So it's about valuing their roles, the important work that we know first responders will be doing, and we have seen happening in every context in which an emergency or a crisis hits, and even in the protected crisis kind of understanding of the ongoing vulnerabilities. So valuing that, acknowledging the types of challenges, but at the same time, not allowing us to assume that the role of the volunteers and the types of organization that they might be willing with will necessarily be protecting them, unless there are actual mechanisms that you have mentioned before, and there are tools that volunteers can easily access and that protect themselves, but also provide safety nets for their own families in case anything arises. And I think it relates to the types of work that we have also been doing collaboratively with the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement in terms of the safety, security, and well-being of volunteers. And I think this goes back to the point that Helene also added to the chat here, which is about the idea that the community agency is often missing from the notion of this informal volunteering activity. And I agree with that. And I think we need to kind of get our heads back to the basic of like, how much can we all also acknowledge this process to be able to understand the everyday as more complex than just formal or informal. So I know that this idea of the formal and informal volunteering is something that we have all been doing and working on for several years, but the levels of informality or formality within the everyday are also very different. And I think understanding that together and learning from each other and from different settings in which we have been working and learning from volunteers is very important also to tackle this romanticized view of volunteers as heroes. And this is, again, not to undermine any type of work, because that's the value of volunteering, as we all know, especially in the sustainable development mindset and pushing for change that is structural in our society, but also how much of some of these challenges are sometimes hidden and then overshadowed by these ideas that volunteers will be necessarily the heroes of our time. And we need to actually understand what is underneath this narrative and how we can support and provide the evidence and provide the practice that we can in our own work to support this process. Yeah.
Great. No, thank you. We have one final question from Helen, who asks, did the Uganda research help you understand volunteering in the context of shrinking civil society space? I'm thinking of the legislation criminalizing LGBTQ plus relationships. I guess this is with regards to Uganda.
I think that's a really good point. And I think this was a recent development that happened when the project had already finished the data collection processes and the whole kind of activities that we were conducting on the ground. But I would definitely say it's pointing towards like the importance of volunteering in a context in which there might be overarching challenges in the civil society mobilization, and specific groups are then more targeted and more vulnerable to specific challenges. So I would say that yes, there are hints of the learning that we can take from this, but also in this particular work we have focused on the volunteering experiences of young refugees themselves. So there is also a scope to understand how much of the volunteering that is undertaken by the nationals and by the wider communities as well might also be related to this response, even if informal or in different ways, to the shrinking civil society processes that we can see happening not only in Uganda but in different contexts. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and I think just on that as well, I think this is where the concept of the formal, non-formal, informal comes in, because I think there's a tendency to kind of look at formal and then just think about formal, and then but in the shrinking of civil society space, the non-formal, informal still continue at some perspective, right? They still organize, they still self-organize, and that's the beauty of that perspective. And we saw that during COVID, right? I mean, that communities, even though they were on lockdown nationally, regionally, locally, on the streets, there were still things happening, and that is equally important, I think for us to think about. So thank you so much, Bianca, for your thoughts. I mean, again, volunteering is a fundamental pillar. It's part of society. It's part of the lived experience. It's local, and I think that's where we start. We don't underestimate. We shouldn't underestimate individual community agency. It's essential for during times of emergencies, but we need to look at the whole ecosystem that is there, not just to kind of pick and choose, because I think we need to look at everything to kind of ensure that volunteers are catered for in that perspective, and not to romanticize them. I think that is also there because they're part of the communities. So really thank you, Bianca, for the thoughts here today, and thank you for colleagues who've been asking questions and sharing comments. I think Gail has reminded us that there is a final session in another few weeks' time. That's part of the last one of this Common Good series. So I please urge you to register for that, share this with others as well. And I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today with this, and find IAVE here. And thank you everyone for your contributions and perspectives, and thank you IAVE for having us there, and go forth and volunteer, as they say. So thank you, and have a good rest of the day, evening, morning if you're starting, and hopefully see you soon. Thank you.
Thanks everyone. Bye.